Today's subject matter is another look back at a previously reviewed game, Star Wars Flight of the Falcon, released in 2003 for the Game Boy Advance, courtesy of THQ and developers Pocket Studios. Bit of interesting trivia piece, as this was the last Star Wars game THQ published for the Game Boy Advance, as the next title and subject of our previous video, Apprentice of the Force, was published by Ubisoft. But apparently this was also the final game to be developed by Pocket Studios, before that company would shut its doors the following year in 2004. Also developed by Pocket Studios is the Game Boy Advance port of Gauntlet Dark Legacy, which probably explains a lot. Oh dear. Anyway, Flight of the Falcon has you assuming command of the famous modified Corellian YT-1300 stock freighter Millennium Falcon, and also on a couple occasions you'll pilot an X-Wing and Luke Skywalker's land speeder for some reason. In this 3D third-person rail shooter game where you're basically flying along a predetermined path, shooting down TIE fighters and avoiding the occasional obstacle or two. The game boasts about 14 levels depicting various battles and scenarios throughout the original Star Wars trilogy, and these levels are grouped into 3 chapters covering each of the 3 films. When you complete all the levels in a given chapter, you're given a password that lets you play the next chapter. So, just to clarify, you're not getting a password after you beat a level, but after you beat the last level of any given chapter. Each chapter in Flight of the Falcon spans about 5 or 6 missions each, and each mission tends to run, to be charitable, a little long. You only get passwords to unlock the Empire and Jedi chapters of the game, and even then you will always start off at the first level of each chapter, with Empire starting you off in the asteroid belt in the aftermath of Hoth, and Jedi putting you in the opening moments of the Battle of Endor, beginning the assault on the second Death Star. Even revisiting a cleared chapter, you'll have to play through the whole thing from scratch, with no option to revisit a specific level until you've got a cheat code enabled. This, in and of itself, is pretty lame, and we haven't even touched on the main game yet. Once all 3 main chapters are cleared, you'll earn another password and unlock a little mini-game controlling the Falcon and shooting down TIEs in an old-school side-view shooter game with power-ups and stuff. Honestly, this should have been the whole game right here. Because it's not much, stupidly simple little shooter with power-ups like speed boosts, extra shields, and there's even a power-up that lets you
do a fucking barrel roll, you stupid son of a bitch!
But it is an infinitely superior game over the main course, and that's even more sad. But I guess we should talk about the main game. Let's start with control. You use the D-pad to move the ship, press A to fire lasers, and press B to launch a wave of concussion missiles that will strike multiple targets. The L and R trigger will control the ship's speed. You'll want to invert the Y-axis in the options. Default has it so pressing up moves up and down moves down, which I'm sure is fine for some people. When you've been playing games like Star Wars Arcade, Rebel Assault, the multitude of flight sim games, or maybe some other rail shooters like Star Fox and such, this feels a bit awkward, and at the very least, you do have the option to change the Y-axis, which I appreciate. With that said, controlling the Falcon is awkward because movement somehow seems overly sensitive, which makes maneuvering a bit of a struggle, particularly in regards to slight movement. It's no help during stages where you're navigating trenches or interiors with obstacles to avoid, though not as bad as something like Rebel Assault, where turns will often attract your ship towards the side and kill you. So it's got that going for it. Your firing range is also somewhat suspect. You have a little targeting reticule, or when I say little, I do mean little, that mostly stays in the center of the field, which means all your shots are directed towards the center with little sway beyond. That means any enemies to the extreme edge of the rails will be out of range. But on top of that, it's not exactly helpful in lining up your shots, partly because the game has issues with depth perception, and seemingly large targets will somehow not be hit by your laser blasts. You do have concussion missiles that will clear away a large number of foes, but sometimes you'll also have proton torpedoes which won't, or something. I'm not quite sure how those work. They're supposed to be seeker missiles or something? I don't know. So your firing range is somewhat limited, the collision detection is somewhat suspect, and the controls are a little awkward to use. Also, this bears repeating, but the levels drag on for way too long. Your objectives usually vary in these things. Sometimes you have to kill a specific number of enemies before you're able to move on. Sometimes you have to reach the end of the path, sometimes before the time limit runs out. But regardless, these levels stretch out for quite a bit, and it gets boring after a while. Even if the game had all its parts in working order, I'd still say these are too long for their own good. And if you die at any point, you restart at the beginning of the level to redo the whole thing all over again. Lose all your lives and it's game over. Fortunately, you have a couple continues and you can continue where you left off, but again the passwords only let you start at the first level of the current episode, which again is not good. Getting a password every few levels was a common trope back in the day, and it wasn't something I was too fond of there either, but this is a new extreme and it sours an already dreadful product even further. Naturally, Flight of the Falcon looks like complete and utter rubbish, using a combination of 3D models and some scaling sprite work to create something of a unique presentation. And for what it's worth, I can admire the temerity, at least, of Pocket Studios to even attempt 3D polygonal models for a game of this ilk on the Game Boy Advance, but that doesn't mean I'm going to say that it looks good, because it really doesn't. The models themselves are rather rough looking, the scaling effects aren't all that great, and the rather choppy frame rate certainly doesn't help matters in that regard. Funny thing is that this was released in 2003 and looks like crap, but 2 years earlier the Game Boy Advance had a similar rail shooter type thing released as a launch title for the system. A little game called Iridian 3D, which we looked at previously. And while the game itself was really nothing special, still pretty decent and pulled off the 3D effect much more effectively with simple sprites and scaling. Flight of the Falcon maybe aimed a bit too high and couldn't quite cut it. This sounds adequate. The game does a fine enough job of recreating some choice tracks from the Star Wars music library, not quite the greatest takes on some classic cinematic compositions, but about as good as you could get on the GBA. Honestly, I'll go ahead and say the sound is probably the only highlight in Flight of the Falcon, and that is extremely faint praise. Okay, the minigame you unlock after you clear everything is also pretty fun, but that's about it, really. Look, there's no nice way to put it, and I'm not going to be cute about it either. Star Wars Flight of the Falcon is a horrible game. It controls poorly, it plays badly, it looks dreadful, and the whole thing is just a complete and utter waste of time at the end of the day. I was sour on this game the first time I reviewed it years ago, and time has definitely done a number on this thing, because it might be even worse than when I first played it. If you want a good rail shooter on the Game Boy Advance, go play Iridian 3D. Not much, but compared to this, that's a fucking great game. Flight of the Falcon, not so much. It's pretty bad. Don't bother. Play something else. There's plenty of better Star Wars games you could be playing. Probably not on the Game Boy Advance, but I may have given that too much.